Conventional wisdom is surely conventional, but it is often not wise. Lawyer and author William Kaplan argues we all need to listen more often to those unconventional voices, which may offer a lot more wisdom than expected. He lays out the case in his new book, Why Dissent Matters, because some people see things the rest of us miss. And Bill Kaplan joins us now here in the studio. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
I want to start with one of the best examples in the book of why we need to listen to dissenting voices. And for that, I'm going to take you back more than 40 years. Israel is at war. And 6 years earlier, they had won a six-day war, shockingly triumphant battle. And just 6 years later, they almost lost their entire country. Tell the story of why.
So what happened was, of course, we all know the story of the Six-Day War. Israel was attacked by its enemies. They vanquished their enemies. They took over the Golan Heights. They took over the Sinai, and they were absolutely confident in their military superiority. And they developed something called the concept of Arab intentions. And basically what the concept was a guiding principle that informed the Israeli security and military establishment that Egypt wouldn't go to war unless Syria went to war, and Syria wouldn't go to war unless Egypt went to war. And they were absolutely convinced of this. Fast forward to October 1973, there had been all sorts of false alarms, belief that there may be an attack, and arms. The Syrians are amassing arms along the Golan, the Egyptians are amassing arms and men along the Suez Canal, but the Israelis held to what they called the concept of Arab intentions, that there wasn't going to be a war. Even when Soviet advisors began leaving both countries, they held to the concept. Even when military supplies began to come in, they held to the concept. They just wouldn't believe that it was going to happen. And they had some lower-level intelligence people who warned them, said, this is about to happen. Moshe Dayan even said when he looked at the satellite photos, it's enough to give you a heart attack.
Huge miscalculation.
Huge miscalculation. 100,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, armaments, artillery, and they just didn't believe it was going to happen. A couple of dissenting voices said, well, hey, take a look, just see what's happening on the other side of the Suez Canal. But they wouldn't believe it. The attack began. They almost lost the country, almost 3,000 casualties. It was a national tragedy. So what the Israelis did in the aftermath of this is they created something called the 10th man. And the job of the 10th man, it could be a 10th woman, a 10th person, is when everyone else says black, the job of that person is to say white, to ensure that a dissenting point of view is taken into account in security and military decision-making.
So they have institutionalized dissent, where? At the cabinet table, in military circles, wherever?
Well, wherever. That was the idea. And that was the idea that first interested me in this book. I thought, what a great idea, because I know from my own professional experience, and just life generally, as we all do, that sometimes the best ideas come from the most unexpected sources. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're listening to people and at least considering what they have to say.
Why are we generally so resistant to the notion that the best ideas can sometimes come from that one person in the corner who is saying counter to what everybody else is saying?
Because the beliefs we have incredible endurance, and it's very hard to give up on our beliefs. And one of the examples I give in the book, of course, is equal marriage. And if you'd ask progressive people, say 40 or 50 years ago, would there be equal marriage in Canada? They would have looked at you like they have, as if you had two heads. Mm-hmm. You know, and in just a generation, what has become yes, it's not maybe anymore, widely accepted. And some of our most strongest held beliefs, we soon learn just aren't so.
Hmm. I saw you give a speech about this recently at the Monk School, and you confessed on that occasion that you had three, in particular, dissidents who were sort of top of your favorite list. So I want to go through them now. They're all deceased. They're not around anymore, but they left very big footprints. So let's go through the list. Frances Kelsey, who was she?
Okay, so I have three favorite dissenters, but the book is filled with all sorts of great dissenters and great stories about dissenters. But I have three favorites. The first is the Canadian Frances Kelsey, the second is the American Rachel Carson, and the third is the Canadian journalist Isabelle Liberté. So Frances Kelsey was a Canadian MD and academic PhD in pharmacology who ended up at the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in Washington in the early 1960s. And her job was to approve or not approve new drug applications. At the time, a drug called Kevidon in the United States had been approved in 50 countries around the world, and its American manufacturer believed that it would be rubber stamped in the United States as well, and they wanted that market. And so they submitted the application, And Frances Kelsey looked at it, and she was a person with tremendous experience in pharmacology and as an MD, and she thought the application was no good. And she kept on pushing back, pushing back, pushing back. Even when they applied intense pressure to her, she kept on saying no. And she kept on saying no to an entitled pharmaceutical company. She kept on saying no within the administration itself, where there was pressure. There's always pressure to approve new drugs. And she kept on saying no to a bad drug application.
How come?
Because the science was no good. And because she was a woman of unusual fortitude, determination, and was not going to approve a sedative when there wasn't a need for the sedative, because there were lots of other sedatives, and the science was no good. And she kept on asking scientific questions about the application, and eventually it turned out that that drug, Kevidon, thalidomide, was injuring babies all over the world. 10 to 15,000 babies injured. Because of her, only 17 in the United States.
This is going back now, what, 50 years? A little more than 50 years?
Early 1960s.
Early 1960s. So because she was the dissident who said no, a lot of,
people were saved.
A lot of people were saved.
Uncommon character, uncommon determination, uncommon resilience, but in her quiet Canadian way, she kept on saying no, no, no.
Number 2 on your list, Rachel Carson. Who is she?
Rachel Carson. Well, she was a scientist and nature lover who was beloved by Americans because she introduced them to the wonders of the sea. But she began to become increasingly concerned in the 1950s about pesticides. And she was concerned that pesticides were entering the food chain. They were destroying, they were becoming biomagnified within animals, and had the potential to destroy life on the planet. And so she began by putting all the pieces together, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring. And this book was an immediate publishing sensation. The President of the United States was behind it. Soon everybody came to be behind it, but she faced an enormous onslaught from the pesticides company. One of the most important economic interests in the United States that just waged an all-out attack on her and her ideas. And one of the things I say in this book is that when people start attacking a person because of their ideas, that's when we have to start paying attention. There's nothing more certain that if an idea is being attacked, it's worth listening to.
Is it an exaggeration to say that she created the environmental movement?
Look, there was an environmental movement before Rachel Carson, and there would have been one without her. But like other protests, for instance, she was the right person at the right time in the right place. Take Occupy Wall Street, which is another protest movement that I discuss in the book. Occupy Wall Street, at least in Zuccotti Park in New York City, was a seedy carnival that accomplished nothing. But the Occupy Wall Street movement, which spread to 80 countries and 1,000 different occupations across the planet, it's changed the global conversation about income inequality. Look, there's always been income inequality. We've always known that it exists. But for the first time ever, people are aware of it. And they're aware that in the same way that Rachel Carson identified that pesticides were threatening life on the planet, income inequality is threatening peace and security on the planet. Did you know, for instance, you probably know this already, but did you know that 2 families in Canada have the combined wealth of the 12 million Canadians at the bottom of the economic ring? Did you know that 40 million Americans need food stamps to survive? Did you know that almost 1 million Canadians go to food banks every week in order to put food on the table for their families? Now, income inequality is probably the most serious problem we face in our society, and it's getting more and more out of hand. Did Occupy Wall Street change it? No. Are we aware of it? Yes. We've been warned. Whether we do anything about it, in the same way, whether we did anything about the warning that Rachel Carson gave us is another matter, but we've been warned.
Number 3 on your list, Isabelle Laborde. Who is she?
So she's another one of my favorite dissenters. She was a Canadian journalist who one day, again, my 3 favorite dissenters come from the 1960s, and all the stories in the book are historical stories because they resonate with people and we actually know what happened, so they're good stories to deal with. But she was a Canadian journalist who read in the paper one day that a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Truscott had been sentenced to hang for the murder of a classmate. And she thought to herself, what kind of society would sentence a 14-year-old to death? I mean, the bigger question, of course, is what kind of society would sentence anyone to death? And we've abolished capital punishment in this country. So she began to look into it. And the more she looked into it, the more she realized that the trial he had received was a farce. It was a kangaroo court. And she wrote a book called The Trial of Stephen Truscott that took everyone on. It took the judges on, it took the police on, it took the Crown Attorney on, it took the entire legal establishment on. And don't forget, in the early 1960s, you know this as well as anyone. You've written a biography of Bill Davis. you've written a biography of John Robarts. You know what Ontario was like then. And we trusted our police. We trusted our judges. We trusted the Crown attorneys to do the right thing and the fair thing. Well, Isabelle Liberté proved that our trust was completely misplaced because she held them all to account in just a withering expose of the inadequacies of the justice system. Now, of course, First Nations and immigrants and other people already had a good sense of the problems with the justice system, but for complacent middle-class Canadians, this was a revelation. And she didn't prove that Stephen Truscott was innocent. No one can ever prove that, but she proved that he had not received a fair trial and there was reasonable doubt. It was a breathtaking, path-breaking book.
What got her spidey senses tingling that justice had not prevailed?
You know, it's what happens so many times. Somebody just gets a sense that something's wrong, and they begin to look into it, and the more they look into it, the more they realize they have to say something. And I guess that comes back to the first point you raised with the 10th man. So they institutionalized dissent by having a 10th man. But the problem with institutionalizing dissent, whether it's the 10th man, the 10th person, or a devil's advocate or whatever, you worry that that person is just playing a role. Like there's Joey or Huey in the corner, and their job is to dissent. So you listen to their dissent, you pat them on the back, and you send them out. Right. You know, and that may be useful, but the most important dissent is the dissent from people who actually believe what they're saying. And those are the people we have to listen to the most.
Here is an excerpt from your book on that very point. Dissent is noisy, messy, inconvenient, costly, often misplaced, sometimes laughable, usually badly timed, and almost always time-consuming. Many dissenters are self-interested and misanthropic. Some of them are just crazy. Well, Bill, this gets at the obvious point. How do you tell the difference between the genuine dissenters and those who are nuts?
Well, that's a very good question, and of course we can't. We can't, because so many of the dissenters, you know, I had the privilege of being able to choose dissenters from history where there's a happy ending to the story. They were all right. You know, and there's lots of dissenters who say all sorts of things, and they're completely wrong. And those aren't the people I'm focusing on. But I think I make a larger point, that there's no idea that I'm afraid of. And there's no idea you're afraid of. I watched your show. You have lots of people come on your show with all sorts of different ideas. You're not afraid of their ideas. You take them on, you challenge them. So the point is not to shut down ideas, but to listen to ideas and then decide. That's the only thing I'm asking for in this book, is that we have a lot of serious problems in our society, like really serious problems. The future of the planet is in peril. Global warming is true. So we need to listen to people, and we need to find solutions to the problems we have in our society.
Well, let me push this back at you. In the case of global warming, or climate change, whatever you want to call it, the dissenting voices today are those who say it doesn't exist. Do we need to listen to them?
Absolutely. I say we listen to climate change skeptics the same way we listen to people who are warning us about global warming. You know, personally, I see the value in doing something about global warming, because the oceans do appear to be rising. Parenthetically, Rachel Carson first observed rising oceans 50 years ago. So, but we can agree or disagree about it. There's all sorts of other movements we can agree or disagree about. You can have the anti-vaxxers in here, for instance, and you can have the people who believe in the science of vaccinations. We can discuss these things. These things can inform us. But you know, there's a big difference between listening to people we disagree with and people who are engaging in hate speech, for instance. You know, people who are engaging in hate speech, who are kicking people while they're down, trying to hurt other people. Those aren't dissenting voices. Those aren't, quote unquote, as President Trump would say, good people. Those are people who are trying to destroy society. Dissent, in fact, is a very, very productive force, because it wants to build and improve our institutions. There's no single idea that you're afraid of.
Can I ask you whether there is there a singular quality that all of your dissenters have which allows them, in the face of threats, in the face of having people come up to them saying, if you do this, your career is over, how do they laugh in the face of all of that?
So this is something I've thought a lot about, because it's ultimately come down, as far as I'm concerned, to character. And what makes character in some people and other people don't have it? Why do some people run to the fire and other people run away from the fire? You know, I don't know the answer to those questions, but I know there are people. I give the example at the end of the book of a guy named Rod Rittenhauer, and he was an American GI who found out about the My Lai massacre. He could have kept quiet, but instead he started talking about it and telling people about it until there was an inquiry into the murder of 500 innocent civilians. Take tank.
William Kaplan went to jail for that.
Briefly, before he was pardoned by President Nixon. Take Tank Man, for instance. Do you remember Tank Man from Tiananmen Square? The guy who stood up.
A single guy in front of the tank.
Single guy. We don't know who he was. We don't know what happened to him. But we know there was a person who stood up because he supported democracy and he was opposed to the authoritarian military regime. Like, there are people that we can point to. Take Dr. Martin Luther King. He paid for his life because of his dissent against racial injustice in the United States. Take Nelson Mandela, father of a nation, because he renounced violence and welcomed everybody in a spirit of reconciliation. What the word is called Ubuntu. I mean, so there are people who have this tremendous character who just want to do what's right.
Does that explain why there are not more dissenters in society? Because there aren't many of us who have that kind of extraordinary character.
Well, we don't all have the opportunity, but we all do have the opportunity to do the right thing. One of the examples I give are the space shuttle stories. There was a Challenger and there was a Columbia. Both space shuttle disasters that could have been prevented if people had spoken up and taken action. And then contrast that with Apollo 13. It was damaged on its way to the moon. What did NASA do? They said failure was not an option. Gene Kranz got in front of mission control and said, there's no bad idea. There are only good ideas. We are not going to stop working until we bring that spacecraft safely home. And so what I say in this book, we've got all of these serious problems. And what we need to do is we have to get the most diverse group of people around and ask them what to do and how to figure out solutions.
In your career in the law or in mediation or arbitration, you've no doubt had to deal with various governments, both provincial and federal. Is there one in your lifetime that you feel was particularly bad when it came to listening to dissenting voices?
I don't know. It's pretty hard to criticize governments because they're making decisions in real time, of course. But I go after the Stephen Harper government in my book.
Okay.
And I go after the Stephen Harper government because they attacked reason, they attacked science, they had a phony war on crime. They did all of these things because they wanted to achieve their political objectives in fast and dirty real time. And we can give all sorts of examples, and I make the case in the book. You know, this sounds incredibly immodest, and I'm sorry for saying this, but this was a government who could care less about evidence. For example, in sentencing, mandatory sentencing, we know they don't work. But instead of figuring out a solution to the sentencing problem that worked, they just increased the sentencing for a whole bunch of crimes and took away the discretion of judges to tailor the sentence to fit the crime. Do you know that this is how crazy it was? We had Stockwell Day say at one point, for instance, that there was an alarming increase in unreported crime. We had the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff saying, we love it when the professors criticize us because it just means that our base feels that we're on the right path. They did all sorts of things. They deprived the research institutes and think tanks of money. They closed environmental research centers. They put more money into applied research away from basic research. I mean, they did a whole bunch of things. The census, of course, is a perfect example. Since the Doomsday Book in 1066, governments have needed to know who's out there and what they're up to so we can have appropriate public policy. They just canceled the census.
The long-form census.
The long-form census.
Mandatory long-form census.
The mandatory long-form census that every 4 years, I think, went to 20% of the population, of which there had been almost no complaints. I mean, this was a government that could care less about evidence and public policy making and was just absolutely determined to achieve its political goals.
You know, governments prize loyalty, and the notion of the loyal opposition, you know, it exists in fact, but whether it exists in spirit is an open question. Do you think governments today need to understand the notion of the loyal opposition?
Absolutely, and I think the opposition has to do the job by opposing what the government's up to, but in a principled way, in a fair-minded way, in a way that, that looks to the evidence. And the truth is we're all committed to the resolution of the important public policy problems we face in society, and I think there has to be a consensus, at least, that we have to listen to everybody in order to come up with solutions. That's the argument I make in the book.
Well, let me pick up on the subtitle, because you say here, because some people see things the rest of us miss. How do we change things in society to the point where the rest of us are not going to miss them? We'll see these things too.
Well, that's a difficult question. I think, you know, we see this a bit in social media, of which I'm no expert, but many people tend to follow websites that sort of are consistent with their own points of view. And when I became active in social media in order to promote my book, I decided to follow all sorts of websites that were completely contrary to how I saw things. And I've actually found it kind of illuminating to get different points of view from different perspectives. And it goes back to what I said a moment ago. Like, there's no idea I'm afraid of.
So get out of the bubble.
Get out of the bubble. And we see, it's called an echo chamber. And one of the chapters in the book deals with all of the cognitive impairments to good decision making. There's optimism bias, there's confirmation bias, there's how we frame issues. Like, I discuss all of these things, and they actually prevent us from getting to the truth. So we have to be aware of them. That's not going to be enough. But we can't just listen to guys who look like us. We have to listen to other people as well. Let's
finish up on this. Are you one?
Am I a dissenter?
Yeah.
No, I'm a guy who's just written a book about dissenters.
You don't think of yourself as one?
No, I don't. I think of myself as a guy who looked at this, realized how important it is to listen to dissenting voices, and have made the case.
I'm going to go back on you a little bit on this, because you're a guy who's sitting here in a suit and a tie. You're a lawyer. You make a decent income, and one of your biggest concerns in life is income inequality, which is not something shared necessarily by most of the people who represent your class and income. So you are a bit of a dissenter.
I think income inequality, no matter where you are in society, threatens peace on the planet. We've done some good things in Ontario, for instance. They've reduced tuition for a huge swath of people to go to university and post-secondary education, which personally I think is one of the biggest access points to social mobility that any of us have, which is the education system. We need to do a lot more. And, and the problem, of course, with income inequality is that capitalism, for all its immorality and all its problems, is, human experience teaches us is the best system we have. But as it becomes more and more extreme, and as people lose faith in it, we have some problems in our society. But you gotta, if you don't mind, let me just add something to that. Look at the huge social change that's taking place in the Western world now. There are going to be millions of people unemployed and unemployable. For instance, we're going to lose all the drivers. We're going to lose all the retail clerks. We're going to lose millions and millions of jobs because of automation and artificial intelligence. And that's not happening in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. That's happening next week, next month, next year, and it's unstoppable. And there are some people, they probably come on your show and say, well, the answer is a basic income for everybody. But of course, there have to be people working to provide the basic income. So we have these huge social problems that they're not just beyond the horizon, they're on the horizon, and we're approaching them quickly. And if we don't figure out a solution to these problems, then our whole society and our way of life will be jeopardized.
The name of the book is Why Dissent Matters, because some people see things the rest of us miss. We are glad not to have missed. William Kaplan in our studio today. Bill, thanks so much for coming in.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.